Just waiting for the little swirly to stop. Okay, here's our updated study roadmap. We are in the middle of our SSO deep dive. For this session and 3 sessions after that, we'll be doing SSO, OpenID, and communities. And then next Wednesday, we're going to start deep diving into OAuth, and that'll be lots of fun. We're going to spend 3 sessions just on OAuth flows to make sure everybody gets to know them and love them. So with that, where are we today? We've got Terry talking about delegated authentication. The presenter for Delegated versus Federated is not going to be able to join us this morning, but Terry, it looks like you're covering both concepts in your presentation, so that's going to be awesome. And then Svatka is going to talk to us about Identity Connect, and that will be all for today. So with that, Terry, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. All right. Are you able to see the slides okay?
Nope, not coming through yet for me.
Oh, helps if I push share.
It's coming, it's coming.
Is that any better?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I tried to cover both topics at least a little bit, and hopefully maybe as a group we can kind of help each other with some of this. I do remember there's quite a bit of this on the exam, and when we get to some of the best practices, I've tried to highlight some of the areas where I remember specifically some of the questions. So hopefully we can help each other as we go through this. So feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go along. I started off with an example, and honestly, I kind of got myself a little bit confused. I started looking at non-Salesforce related authentication from the standpoint of what was considered delegated authentication, and what I'm hoping maybe as we go through this, you can kind of help clarify some of that for me. But here's an example. If you're a homeowner in a suburbs, you have your own home. A visitor comes to the door. You're the one responsible for answering that door and validating who they are before you let them in. If you're a homeowner, say in a gated community, a visitor comes to the community, security guard at the gate verifies who they are, and the guard confirms whether they're allowed to be there or not. If they are, he logs their arrival and opens the gate and allows them in. The gated community is an example of what I'm terming outsourcing authentication. The security guard has basically been entrusted to manage that security. So if we look at that from the standpoint of computer terms, if it's the standalone home, we can think of that as an application, and authentication and authorization services are built into, say, an application. So the application itself is responsible for all aspects of authentication and authorization. In the gated community would be considered a web server, and the home in the gated community would be a web application. The security guard is the form of single sign-on where they authenticate who the visitor is. They open the gate to authorize them to enter, and they'll use audit logs to document the visitor's arrival. So that's just kind of we talked about some different examples like that, I think in our last meeting, and so that's just another variation of the similar thing. So it kind of helped me to leverage that term outsourcing. When a web service outsources its authentication to another affiliated but unrelated web service is what we're talking about with here. And so federated authentication and delegated authentication, these are kind of the key differences between the two. Federated uses SAML. It supports authentication and authorization. Salesforce admins can enable this, and I think we saw some of that last week. And here's a key difference here as well, is it's an org-wide level setting. With delegated, it uses LDAP or security tokens. It's authentication only, and so if that is incorrect, please correct me. But from what I was seeing, it is authentication only. It requires Salesforce support to turn it on, so we have to contact Salesforce to enable it. And the key difference here is that it's at a permission level, and we'll see that here in a little bit. Any questions or comments on those differences between the two? All right. So let's dive a little deeper into the delegated side of things. And I've got links underneath these, and I've also put them in our spreadsheet that takes you to the Salesforce help page where it kind of talks about this process. So delegated authentication offers greater flexibility given it's managed at the permission level. So we can require some users to use delegated authentication while allowing others to use Salesforce passwords. It's considered to have stronger security, primarily because it's using a secure identity provider. Private login pages are accessible only behind a corporate firewall. And I think that's a key distinction there, that your login process is behind your corporate firewall, which then reduces phishing attacks. It differentiates your org from all other companies in Salesforce. All right, and when you turn on, or you ask Salesforce to enable delegated authentication, what happens is a new permission is created within your profiles that's called is single sign-on enabled. And if that is enabled, Salesforce password policies are no longer going to apply for that user. So your identity provider is managing all things related to the password policies at that point. The web service validates the username, password, and its source IP. And I remember this one being on the test. It only returns either a true or false, indicating that they have permission to enter, or false, they would get an error message and be denied access. Any questions so far?
So that sounds very different, not a question, more observation. That sounds very different from federated authentication, where we're getting all sorts of information in the SAML assertion about our user. And here it's literally just, yes, they can, or no, they can't, sounds like.
That's what I was reading. Does anybody use a delegated authentication?
We used it at a prior site. That was our main way of logging in. Because we had an in-house, like it says, an in-house identity provider that we utilized. I never set it up though, so I'm not sure a lot of the details. I basically just used it.
Okay.
I had to set it up at one point for a customer, and their case was that they had an existing portal that they were using, and they were using their internal authentications, but they also wanted to have Salesforce do that, so that all the employees using this portal, using general authentication, could also come into Salesforce. That's typical use case where this delegated authentication works. But in that situation, actually, they had to put in a proxy service to be able to reach out to the internet, so that it could be also reached outside. So that security concept that mentioned before might not apply in this situation with Salesforce, but certainly apply for internal users when they're sitting in the office.
Yeah, I kind of wondered about that too, and back on the previous slide where the private login page is accessible only behind the corporate firewall, because when we got into some of this later portions of it, as I was reading, it sounded like that login page had to be accessible by Salesforce, which meant it had to be in the DMZ.
Well, the login page, I think, is fine to be not accessible. What is need to be accessible is the service that Salesforce will call into, because it's basically that web service that you develop, which we had to provide information for. We didn't build a web service. It's a customer developers would build that service, because we don't have access to their internal obviously servers and Windows or whatever the servers they are. But that's I think there's some distinction there. I think that the login page can be private potentially, but the service that Salesforce reaches out to would have to be reachable through the DMZ, which is quite different. And that service is essentially that's true false. From my understanding and from using it in the past, that is really the distinction. Salesforce really does not care, who that is, what they are, what it is. As long as they get this true, they say, okay, well, this guy is authorized, or this person is like, hey, we okay to authorize him.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
The other way too to deal with it being on the internal private is you can get through your firewall through proxies, and I do remember ours was set up to a specific URL with a port that was established for that proxy through into that internal web service.
Very good. Yeah, that's helpful. There was quite a bit on the exam from what I remember regarding delegated authentication, and having people who have done it and can speak to it is really helpful, because it's a little hard to set up on our own. All right, some delegated authentication providers, some names you might recognize, and I don't know how you say this one. OKTA Identity Cloud Ping. I've ran into that one a few times. And then NetIQ's Cloud Access. I'm sure there's others out there that do this as well.
So I've got a question on this. If delegated authentication is supposed to be like an on-prem thing and it's inside your corporate network, and these guys are cloud providers,
I know.
How does that work?
I wondered that same thing. It was confusing to me.
I think Pavitra was setting something up with Okta. I don't think she's on the call this morning. We might have to reach out to her about that, because that just seems contradictory.
For Ping though, is a cloud provider. Ping can also be hosted on your own services, like on-prem.
Okay.
Well,
I know that.
Yeah, I think over here they're listing identity providers specifically. Right, and delegated authentication by itself, that service is not an identity provider. It's just a gateway to get to the identity provider, whatever that is. Frequently, that is behind firewall ADP. But the corporation might be actually using one of these cloud providers that's not like internal. Well, some of it might be like Ping might be internally installed, but Okta certainly not. And I'm not sure about NetIQ. But that's really just the entity that does the authorization itself of user ID and password and stores this user ID and password versus the gateway it comes through. So it could be actually coming in from the cloud, going inside, hitting the service, and going back out to the cloud to authorize and come back again. And you go that dense sort of going around.
Oh, that makes more sense.
Okay, good.
So the delegation server, or whatever you want to call it, is sitting, and it's just got a few special access ports out to the public internet to do the authorization and then to send people out where they need to go, but
Right.
can't do much else. Okay.
Potentially that's where these would come in. But frequently, at least in cases I've seen it, customers use it. It's typically internal, like they have some type of LDAP or usually AD services that they do not want exposed to the public.
Okay, that makes sense.
And again, just a follow-up question. Is there a standard on how the communication happens, or is it more of a, working through different vendors and figuring out how the flow actually happens? I was just open for anyone.
So no, I think if you're asking for like something like a SAML type of flow, delegated authentication as a concept is a standard thing that's used by other software vendors. In Salesforce situation, the service is what really makes things connect together, because that's a service that calls some other internal services that does the authorization, passing in those credentials or user IDs, whatever they need to, or how they choose to do the authentication. It's that service information that is responsible, or service creator who is responsible to maintain the security of that service. Because obviously, if you break through that, then you have access. but it's not like there is a XML standard that carries these tags and things like that. There's certain standard that delegated authentication has, which I think been listed before. Like you need to have IP, source IP, and there's a user ID and some other credentials or something like that.
Yeah, the password.
Yeah, so that's something you have to. These are actually required pieces of information you need to build in your service and pass in through to that service to authenticate. But the fact is that service could be built in anything. It could be built in Windows, could be built in Java or whatever. And the way it's built is you actually extract a WSDL from Salesforce and provide to your developer, who will build according to that WSDL. And it's a SOAP service, from my understanding. I don't think there is a REST option for that. And that's something I actually would have a question, like, can you do a REST with delegated authentication? I just wondered.
Yeah, I don't know on that, but you're connecting a lot of the missing dots that I had, so that's really helpful. So this web service is something that has to be created in order to stand up.
Yeah, it has to be built by, well, either you build it if you're consulting, and potentially maybe somebody asks you to build it, you may have to. But in typical situation, it's internal developers who know where the DMZ is, where it needs to be deployed, how it needs to be opened, and they're working with IT. I remember from a previous experience, it took something like, I don't know, 3-4 months to actually get IT to open up appropriate ports for this thing to connect. So just keep that in mind.
Wow.
Fun times.
All right, that's really good.
One question: is a source IP is a mandatory, or it's?
So can you say
Could
that?
you repeat that, Joseph?
Is a source IP address is a mandatory field? Like for the input, for the username and password and the IP?
You mean is it an input field, or is it just sending it through based on where the user is?
Yes, it is. So the fields that listed there, like the username, password, and source IP, I think there's something else there. I think there's like 4 parameters, maybe. I don't remember. But those are all required because they're part of the WSDL that Salesforce would provide. And if, for example, Salesforce would change this at some point, then that will be additional fields.
But the user isn't entering the source IP, right? That's just getting detected somehow.
Right.
Well, that's something that. So I think what it is this service will be called by Salesforce, right? Ultimately. Right.
And so Salesforce, from its delegated authentication provider, needs to be provided with the source IP. No, wait a second. Okay, now I'm getting confused. So Salesforce just gets the true or false, right? It's the authentication service that needs to know the username, the password, and the source IP, and then all it tells Salesforce is, yes, this person's allowed in.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah.
The reason I asked the source IP because somewhere I heard that it is used for portals. So portals supposed to be internet, right? So how we can define the IP ranges? Does it make sense?
Well, I think the source IP they're talking about is the source IP where the web page or web browser is coming from, not where the service is coming from. This IP address is essentially, if I am a user, I'm hitting this page, and I need to put in my credentials here, that's the source IP they're expecting to be called.
Okay. Thank you.
One of the other things that I was reading on this is that this information is encrypted as it's passed between the different services. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, I mean this has to be an HTTPS kind of thing. I don't think you're even allowed to do HTTP at this point with delegated authentication. It has to be like secure channel via SSL or TLS, one of those.
And the reason for that is because of the information being passed.
Yes, I mean you're obviously giving out credentials here, and so that could be sniffed.
Yeah. Really good questions. Any others before we move on? All right. Some best practices. I've just listed some. The link here gives you a more extensive list, but the ones that are asterisked here are ones that I personally remember being on the exam. Your organization's implementation of the web service must be accessible by Salesforce servers. So again, that service needs to be in your DMZ or somewhere publicly available. If requests take longer than 10 seconds to process, it will fail. So you will get a false. And here is where we talked about the WSDL being used. That is considered a best practice. It is case sensitive. And then make your web service available by TLS. Use a certificate from a trusted provider, VeriSign or one of those guys. So again, this does have to be a trusted provider. It will not work with a self-signed certificate. Use the source IP to restrict access based on a user's location. And then don't enable single sign-on for Salesforce admins, primarily there because you don't want to inadvertently lock out your admins to Salesforce. And they highly recommend that you use a developer or a sandbox when creating this solution. And again, there's some more in the link listed there as well.
So I have a question on this. One of the parts of the study guide says know the risks associated with delegated authentication. And I haven't found anything on what the risks are. If anything, this seems more secure. And even the documentation says it's more secure because it reduces phishing. So I'm opening this up to the group. What would be some of the risks of delegated authentication other than maybe like your login request timing out or your admin getting locked out accidentally?
I would think the risks, and from just looking just like you are in a study guide and looking at the documentation, a couple of risks there is the fact that, first of all, we don't know who's developing this service. We don't know the skill level or knowledge level of these developers or these IT department, and it's not hindered. So Salesforce provides you this trust thing where you trust the Salesforce that it will hold your password secure and encrypt and all that stuff, right? Well, here you have a service that will call some other internal provider or maybe external provider through some other channels to actually authorize you, but passing your credentials. So that service gets your credentials, right? And so however that service is implemented in the DMZ or in some other reverse proxy kind of mode or whatever, that could potentially open up some challenges for security review. That's kind of where I see one of the risks potentially in actual development and deploying this thing. So there's an IT risk associated with it, network administrative risks, plus the developer risk, like how well is it coded? Is it using secure standards? If it's Java, if it's .NET or whatever that they're using.
Okay, and it looks like Joseph just posted a link in the chat, so check out the chat, everybody, to find that link. Joseph, can you post that in the resource sheet as well when you get a moment?
Yep, sure, I'll do that.
Thanks.
Other questions on best practices? All right, Federation best practices. Get the Salesforce login URL from the single sign-on settings pages. That basically just means make sure you're using your my.salesforce.com login. Make sure that the server's clock is up to date. The IDP and Salesforce must be within 3 minutes of each other. Use the SAML assert validator, which we looked at last week to troubleshoot any issues. Map your org's internal usernames and Salesforce usernames. The federated identifier field can be used for unique identifiers. Use the My Domain feature to prevent users from logging into Salesforce directly. So what they're saying there is just use your my.salesforce URL as opposed to the login.salesforce URL. So that's the one that they recommend you give out to users. And then sandbox copies are made with Federation authentication, or I'm sorry, with SAML disabled on your sandboxes. So when you create a new sandbox, remember that SAML will be just turned off. Any questions on the Federation best practices? And again, this link has some additional ones as well. And I think that is my last slide. So any other questions or comments related to Federation or delegated authentication?
Just kind of wanted to open it up to a group. Are any other pros or cons of federated versus delegated? Can you think of situations where you might want to use one versus the other?
My understanding was that Salesforce is pushing more to using SAML. That kind of the delegated was an older technology. I think that's part of why you have to have it turned on. Most of the conversations I've heard, they've always said, well, if you have availability to use SAML, go that route. Now, maybe just because it's less, it's easier to set up.
So I think one of the reasons is some of the legacy authentication mechanisms. So if the company operates or enterprise that you're working with it, installing Salesforce or implementing Salesforce, using already existing system that does not support SAML, but they want to continue using it, right? So if the system they have supports SAML, then practically, speaking, there is no reason to go through the pain of delegated authentication, writing services, incurring all kinds of taxes on that, or technical debt. But when the cases are where, okay, there's something homegrown or maybe some other legacy system that they use, it does not support SAML, right? Maybe some other thing, and they do expose some service that could be called. That's where delegated authentication would be the only way to actually leverage that and fulfill the customer's requirement, right?
I thought I remember reading something about mobile apps as well needing to be used delegated.
No. I mean, mobile apps can use anything, SAML or typically mobile apps don't even use that. They use auth to authenticate, but they could be using auth via SAML, right? So there will be a authenticating OIDP provider behind them to actually provide that ability to log in, and then they get a token and all that stuff.
Okay. I think when I was looking out more generically public on non-Salesforce things, it's where I got myself a little bit confused, because in some of the websites that I saw, they consider federated, they consider all of this a delegated authentication. So it basically meaning you're giving somebody else the authority to authenticate for you. And so it really kind of blurred the lines between what's the difference between delegated and federated best practices. So don't go out and confuse yourself like I did.
Yes, stay on the happy path with Salesforce ecosystem. Don't go out there to other worlds. I mean, this is a certification for the Salesforce stuff. So.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Terry. Awesome job. Svatka, you are up with Identity Connect.
Hello, everybody. Good morning.
Morning.
Find my screen. Here we go. Morning, Igor. Good to hear your voice, man.
Morning, Svatka.
Right, can you see my screen good?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right, Identity Connect. So one of those things that Igor just said, right, stay on a Salesforce side. Well, we're going to divert a little bit to the hardware side a little bit, just a smidge. So not my strong side, but here are some definitions and benefits. I thought I would start with the definitions for the group this morning. Salesforce Identity is a product that helps admins apply all of the data collected in Active Directory and pretty much automate the user management, right? One thing that is important for us to know is it syncs one way, and I'll be showing it in a, pretty soon here. So it only goes from Active Directory to Salesforce. Additional cost. It's here clearly it presents this particular product is available in those 3 editions, Enterprise, Performance, and Unlimited. We can have some in developer as well, but it comes at additional cost. A couple things that I have found in terms of benefits using Identity Connect, was in terms of keeping employees happy. So when you get a brand new hire and they are starting day 1, they have access to all the systems, assuming that they are provisioned in AD. They should be able to hop in Salesforce and work right after that. We have the concept of SSO. So SSO is something that's supposedly optional in terms of, that you can be using Active Directory's username and passcode, that you can just use that and you can turn off the passcode, username and passcode on a Salesforce site altogether. Of course, we talked about benefits of SSO in the past, keeping offboarding faster and secure. So making sure that people will be locked out of mobile and all the other areas as soon as they are offboarded should they leave the company altogether. One thing that was interesting to read here is that Identity Connect does not need admin access to your Active Directory. It only needs read-only access to the Active Directory users and groups. Already mentioned, it's an add-on, and the configuration options. There is a possible configuration option, and I'm going to get to it in a mapping area where you can choose which attributes you would like to be overwritten from Active Directory to Salesforce. So assuming you have attributes on a Salesforce side that you don't want to sync between AD and Salesforce, you can actually do that. So that gives us a little bit of options in terms of configuration. So here I thought that I don't have donuts, but I have One Direction. Yeah. I was having too much fun last night. So just remember, it only goes one way, you guys. So we have access to Active Directory, right? So we have that. You also need a Java runtime environment, which means the server somewhere out there. It's not all cloud. And Salesforce, right? Now, in terms of the mapping, so this was something that I wanted to sort of outline with 2 images here. And so the first one over here on the right-hand side, I wanted to sort of outline that when you do choose your data source in the mapping, that's where you can locate it right here in terms of the path and whatnot. I just wanted to put the UI there because I don't know that all of us have seen the UI altogether. You can establish the sync, first-time provisioning, and future updates. There is a concept of a base context, which is sort of configuring where do you start searching within the Active Directory for, like how do you actually define and navigate the Active Directory and configure that, right? As well as which user and group filters you're gonna further use to maybe smaller or shorten that pool of resources that you're gonna locate. As well as the attribute mapping. So this is where that second image comes here in terms of the attribute mapping. And I sort of put myself a reminder here that if you guys use data loader mapping in a past, it kind of looks similar to this. You have a source destination in terms of the attributes. You can also add your own and you can do transformations. Number one thing, Active Directory groups to Salesforce profiles, permissions, and roles. So there is also, and I don't have a screenshot for that for you guys today, but there is a way, and that's probably the most important one, is to ensure that when you do create a user, when you choose to create a user in Salesforce through Active Directory, that you have the proper settings for what is this user going to have in terms of profiles, permissions, and roles? I'm going to pause right here if anybody has any questions.
I thought you could also map a group to a public group in Salesforce, in addition to the 3 things you have there.
Okay. Good to know. Any other questions in terms of what we can do and how we can configure? Okay. So in terms of deployments, and this is where I just put a couple of my sort of, notes in terms of how I remember different things.
Svatka, I was on mute. I had a question.
Go ahead.
Does it also support provisioning roles for the communities, for the community users?
If it yeah, I would imagine so, since it has roles.
Okay.
Igor, do you happen to know that one?
No, I actually haven't used Identity Connect with communities.
Yeah, neither
before.
have I.
I mean,
That's a good question.
I think it can map the roles. I don't know if it can do specifically for the community. For the user, I guess probably should be. If it can do a role, then it should be the same thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the answer is yes, but let's take a look a little closer. We'll have to do further research there. So in terms of sort of the setup, those were really good images that helped me to understand what this looks like. Oh, one thing that I just wanted to point out, firewall versus DMZ. So Identity Connect can be set up in DMZ, and it's probably recommended. And the reason for that is so that your users don't have to use VPN to get to Salesforce. DMZ is the militarized zone, so it's an area that it's not behind your firewall. It is still on your network, but it is not behind the firewall. That is my understanding. Here it shows for Terry, not for Terry, but there is the concept of it has to be encrypted. It goes through HTTPS over to Salesforce. And it actually has, and I thought this was interesting as well, is that you probably will see that you will have multiple Salesforce instances at a customer, right? So yes, you can actually have it go to many orgs. But if you thought this was a simple picture, let's take a look at more pictures here. And so this is a scenario, and I thought it was interesting as well. You're going to see this quite a lot, that post-M&A setups, right? So you're going to have some Active Directories coming from couple different companies, right? So merger and acquisitions, you have 2 companies coming together as one. How do we solve for that day one? So this is a quick example of, I think, what Salesforce did with ExactTarget, that originally they had they created 2 separate setups before they actually went through the second model, which is the global catalog, where you can actually go in and have a couple Active Directories using through global catalog once Salesforce Identity Connect to Salesforce. And so I don't know if anybody on a call is currently using one or the other setup, or have seen or have worked with one. So I'm going to open this up for chat. And looks like no one has used more than one AD setup today, I suppose.
Nobody's had to deal with the merger yet.
Just yet. Just yet. But so just wanted to show you that there are different combinations, right, that we can see in the ecosystem there. And a few closing sort of remarks, statements here in terms of features. You can brand your login page with logos, so you don't have to have that Salesforce logo on the login page. The concept of a sync, scheduled both versus live updates versus both. So it is recommended that you use both. And the reason for that is because we are dealing with servers which could potentially go down. So you would have the live updates happening, sort of queued up to happen all the time. So if there is a minor change on a user account in Active Directory, then it would directly flow to Salesforce within seconds. But then you would use the scheduled in case there is some downtime. And so that would be basically catching all. But then there was that notion of that scheduled actually takes more API calls, because it has to go and queue up all of the settings again, rather than just taking that one change over. So just putting it out there that it is recommendation to set up both. And I think there is actually both checkboxes there on a screen when you configure those. There are reports available for the monitor sync activity to seeing if that sync actually worked, didn't, how often, who just synced, who just logged in, as well as there is the option to disable all Salesforce passwords. Now, when you were just chatting, Natalya, about risks, I just recalled the one risk that I saw in the Trailhead, which was saying that watch for your setup and a sequence. So if you were to turn on a sync before you configure the profile rule permission rules, you could technically override all your users to one default profile because that sync would kick right in. So I think there is definitely, this one has sort of that risk element in terms of if you go out of sequence on setup. And that's all from me today. Oh, I have my resources, and I'll put those in the resource tab.
Awesome, thank you. So the login page, is it basically it's not a Salesforce login page? It's this Identity Connect login page instead, or is it like a button on my domain, like with the other ones?
It looked like a Salesforce login page where you could switch out a logo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Svatka, I had a couple of questions. One thing I thought I saw when I was reading through the Trailhead on this one, that it also does provide the authentication service. Is that right? It can also be the ID provider.
Well, an ID provider would be someone who stores username and passcodes, right? And so for that we have our Active Directory. So I don't know that I know that answer for you. Besides, I think that Active Directory is your source of truth for your username and passcodes.
Yeah. So what I mean to say is, like it could be one of those services like Ping. Does it? It might. I don't know. This is where I'm struggling.
Oh, you're trying to say it's synonymous to like Okta or Ping? I didn't think about that this way. I don't know. It's a good question.
Everything I read made it sound like it's specific for Active Directory.
Well, I've heard somebody, at least one of the presentation on this Identity Connect, maybe Dreamforce or maybe Trailhead DX, and they mentioned that this is the Identity Connect could be synonymous to a ETL tool for identity, which is basically moving data or synchronizing data between two different sources. But then also somewhere in documentation, I've read that Identity Connect as a product can serve as an IDP. But the way it doesn't store your credentials. What it does, it connects to the credential storage, which could be your LDAP or some kind of database internally or something like that, which it could map the data from or source the data from. And then it could work with Salesforce. It's specific with Salesforce, but it is what I've heard. And that's a little bit confusing to me because I always thought like, well, if it's an ATL tool, it should be just synchronization of my resources. Like, hey, if I have a password, user ID, role, profile, whatever, just move that to Salesforce. If I update that in my source, update it in Salesforce. That's kind of what I thought of it. Never thought of it as an IDP, but I've heard there was some, at least in reading through this, but kind of learning about it, I've read a few references that could be IDP, which sounds like if it can provide a login page, that's kind of what they're talking about. Is that right, Svatka?
Right.
Because the login page is part of this Identity Connect, right? That's where you actually have the login page where you can customize it.
That's correct.
Okay.
So it's a little tricky because Identity Connect itself isn't storing the passwords, but it's giving kind of the gateway to for the user to enter their password username, and then it bounces that back to Active Directory. Or I guess it actually passes it through to Active Directory.
Well, it goes and searches Active Directory, right? So it kind of queries it, if you will. So, and that same notion of this is ETL, it just transforms your data, right? But it's still either passes or not, right? So, yeah.
As far as user provisioning is concerned, is this the ideal tool or the only tool option that we have for that functionality?
Okay, ask me differently. So it can provision your users.
Right. Is there other tools that can provision users? Or is this basically our only option?
Oh, I see. So out of all the other choices that we have seen so far, is Identity Connect the only one that provisions? I don't think so. So you have the just-in-time provisioning with code, and from other ways. I'm probably not the best person to talk about.
Sorry, I wasn't directing it specifically.
I'm like, whoa. I probably should know all of those, but there are a number of other ones that I would imagine that you can use for provisioning users. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's actually some stuff coming up either this next study session or the next one on just-in-time provisioning, where it can work with SAML and with federated authentication.
Mm-hmm.
So
The
answer is yes. There are other options, Terry.
Here's another question that I was kind of thinking through. So Identity Connect is a software piece that's probably one of the rare pieces that Salesforce built and provides as a on-premise to be installed behind a firewall. Does use of that tool requires you to have Identity Connect licenses?
Yes.
Identity licenses, like external, internal. Can you elaborate? Because I kind of that's get a little bit confusing.
Yeah, so I'm kind of confused on that notion as well. I know you have to have at least one. Now, what does that mean? Is a different question. So I know you at least have to have one, kind of like when you have ETL tool and you have to have one user. So at least one, but I don't know what other use cases for the others. And maybe it's with the different combinations of different, like if you have to connect to more than one Salesforce, maybe that's when it gets out into you have to have more licensing. But
yeah, the one thing I saw, I mean, speaking of licensing, it's not available as an add-on on all products. So somebody asked about like portals and communities. From what I saw, like you can add this on to like Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, and I think a platform license. So I don't know that this would even apply to communities, because it didn't look like you could add that on to community licenses.
Well,
although
no,
if you have communities, you already have probably Sales Cloud or Service Cloud already.
Well, I was asking more if there is a license type of identity license, right? And then there's an external identity license or just identity license, which is used by employees or something like that. And that's what I was kind of referring to, which I think Identity Connect does need one of these licenses to be existing, which I believe every org that's active in production have a couple of these licenses automatically given it. That's my understanding is, or correct me if I'm wrong here.
Well, and earlier on, we had talked about there are identity-only licenses that you can purchase for employees, but those are separate from Identity Connect. The identity-only licenses basically let you provision a user in Salesforce if you're using Salesforce as your IDP to get out to other apps like SAP or something. But that's not Identity Connect.
Yeah, so I think the answer is at least one. I just put a link in our chat. There is a chatter group that has a little more on Salesforce identity, and I think there are a couple other resources so you guys can take a look at that group.
Awesome. Thank you, Svatka. Any other comments, questions on delegated authentication, federated authentication, Identity Connect? Anything else? All right. Well, let's take a look at what's coming. All right, as always, a reminder that the resource links are available for you. Thank you for everyone that's been posting links on the resources guide. There's all sorts of good information piling up in there. And next session, hey, speaking of just-in-time provisioning, look at that. It's on the study plan for the next couple of days. So there's your links to your sessions. They're also in the study plan sheet. And then on Wednesday, Wednesday's show and tell day. So we got Igor, Amit, and David telling us all sorts of stuff about SSO and just-in-time provisioning. And with that, unless anybody has any final thoughts, we are done for today. Recording is now paused. If I can get to my Google, I'll just go up here. All right, and with that, we are done with the session, and I'll hang out till the last person leaves.